Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
खाना इतना महंगा है यहाँ। और खर्चा करते हैं कि खाने के लिए तो फिर दवा का खर्चा करने निकलता है।
The problem is shade is a privilege. It is an elite commodity.
गर्मी पड़ रही है तो गर्मी में काम धंधा नहीं है, एकदम काम धंधा मंदा हो गया।
According to the World Bank, 75% of India's labor force is heat exposed, which is a huge number. It's like more than 350 million people. So, say a farmer might be going from a heat wave, which is a problem and impacts the crop, to a context where there are urban heat waves. It's taking one set of hazards and trading it off for another set of hazards.
Hello, Aditya. Thanks so much for chatting to us today. For our listeners, I am speaking to Aditya Pillai, who is a doctoral researcher at King's College London and a visiting fellow at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. So, welcome, Aditya, and I am very excited to speak to you about heat and heat stress today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's very exciting to be here, and I'm excited to chat with you about heat.
So perhaps we could start off a little bit with just you giving us an introduction of the type of work you do and maybe what drew you to this area of work in the first place.
So, I am, I think, what they colloquially call a policy researcher, which is basically trying to figure out solutions that the state can implement to solve problems that face us all. Heat is interesting. It's not what I started out doing. And I think sometime in the late 2010s, early 2020s, I think it started becoming very clear to me that the global conversation on mitigation, which is reducing carbon emissions to reduce temperature increases over the coming years and decades due to global warming, it became very clear to me that that was not going to hit the targets we'd set for ourselves through the multilateral UN process. And at the same time, it started becoming very clear that the impacts that had been foreseen were definitely graver than we actually expected. So I started thinking more about adapting to climate change than reducing the carbon emissions problem, and something I'd been doing earlier with my work on water. But the actual impetus for heat came actually completely randomly. I used to own a motorbike, and it was the middle of a heat wave. And I remember the exact moment of stopping at a red light, and there were maybe 5 or 6 Swiggy, Zomato drivers, delivery agents around me. And I was suffering because the engine must have been at like 150 degrees or 170 degrees. It was like right between your legs. And there was absolutely no shade at the red light. It was a 40-minute ride or 35 minutes or something, and I was completely exhausted. Like for the rest of the day, I was more tired than I normally would have been. And that got me thinking about what it meant to be a delivery agent, right? Basically, you're pulling like a 12-hour day through a heat wave with breaks that are completely random, and most of the time you're completely exposed to the elements because you're really far away from home. There's not a lot of place you can go to access cooling apart from shade, which is also disappearing. And I came back and I started trying to understand what determined where shade was erected in a city, because it's a conscious decision to do that, which then led me down a rabbit hole. And then I found out about these things called heat action plans, which are supposed to be more all-encompassing than just shade. It's a part of it, but it's also about hydration and so on and so forth. And I realized there were a bunch of these things floating around, but no one actually like sort of systematically analyzed them or studied them. And I used to be at an organization called the Center for Policy Research, which is a New Delhi-based think tank. And I was trying to figure out what to do in the adaptation world. And I thought, well, actually, this is clearly something that needs to be addressed. It's only going to be more of a problem, right? That's how the atmosphere works. The more carbon you pump in, the more heat waves you have, and the more people are going to die and suffer, and the more cities are going to grind to a halt, and so on. So I thought, okay, so maybe this is the thing to work on, these heat plans. So that's how I got into it.
Thank you for that background, Aditya. I think that heat impacts people on an everyday basis. I think, like, I've been thinking about this recently as well, even when I'm drinking my morning coffee, because I see people at construction site next door, and there's, as usual in a lot of parts of Delhi, this continued process of demolition and then putting up new buildings, and they're doing this in the searing heat. There's absolutely no shade. I don't know about their access to water. It doesn't seem like there's much. And I don't even know about what they have in terms of rest hours, that kind of stuff. So what is this heat action plan? What is a heat action plan? What does it mean? Who develops it? What does it really entail?
Heat is something that's going to decrease productivity and increase deaths in a very substantial way over the coming years. And the heat action plans are basically the only response we have to this emerged problem, right? And the way a heat action plan normally looks, maybe it's useful to run your listeners through the typical heat action plan. It usually has some sort of introduction about how heat is such a big problem. And then it has some sort of profile of what the heat threat is to a place. And then it'll list out who the vulnerable people are in that place. And then it'll list out the solutions. And then it'll list out the institutional structure that is supposed to implement the solutions.
In terms of what's in these heat action plans, so basically they look at an early warning system. So how do you predict when a heat wave is going to happen? The second component is all about sort of raising community awareness. The third component is in terms of building capacity of the health system. So the doctors, the nurses, trained to identify these heat-related illnesses. And finally, fourth component of these heat action plans deals with the more long-term planning. How do we adapt to heat waves and heat stress?
The really interesting bit about all of this is that it is a hyper-decentralized policy instrument, in the sense that cities and districts all come up with their own heat action plans. There's notionally a template by the National Disaster Management Authority that broadly sets the structure, but like most of the substance comes from a hyper-local level. Most of it is done by consultants or NGOs or national organizations who work with these local governments. There's even conversation about village level heat action plans. And, so there's this multiplicity of types of heat action plans. Some are super slim and are 2 pages, and it's just a bunch of do's and don'ts for people. And it's just stuff the government is supposed to advertise during a heat wave. And others are far more structurally sophisticated, and they think about urban heat island maps, and they have more detailed planning on how the urban structure should be and so on. But like I said, they're not grounded in law and they don't have specific financial backing. So basically what ends up happening is there's a lot of unevenness in how they're implemented. So you'll see some places where, for example, if there's been a prior heat wave event where many hundreds of people have died, you'll see more aggressive action.
As these women travel to different areas of the city to sell their handicrafts, Ahmedabad has come up with a newer approach to beat the heat.
तो अभी जो हम देख रहे हैं, जो चालू कुल बस स्टॉप है, उसमें हमने हाई प्रेशर मिस्टिंग सिस्टम इंस्टॉल किए है। तो ये कूलिंग टेक्नोलॉजी से जो लोग ये बस स्टॉप में वेटिंग एरिया में या बैठते हैं, तो उनको मिनिमम 4 से 60 डिग्री तक का लोअर टेम्परेचर फील होता है। मतलब बाहर 45 डिग्री है, तो यहाँ पर वो 38-39 डिग्री फील करेंगे।
So, for example, Ahmedabad or Bhubaneswar, and then there are places that should have a heat action plan being implemented but don't, right? Or have only very recently started doing it. Places like Kolkata or New Delhi. And New Delhi started this year, thankfully. So this is the broad brush sort of what heat action plans are. I will just say one thing, which is, in a federal structure like India's, any decentralized plan really requires some thought on how you'd implement them, because local government tends to be less powerful than higher orders of government. Unlike, say, in the United States, where the federal structure is kind of flipped and it's really like a local government story, the federal government playing a backstop, right? So that kind of complicates a lot of adaptation to climate change, which is a hyperlocal problem. But India has a top-heavy federal structure. So that's a little bit of background to why it's a complicated thing to solve.
No, thanks for that, Aditya. So I was wondering, if I understood correctly, then is it possible for a city to have a heat action plan, but then say also a district to have a heat action plan? Like, how do these things link to each other then?
Yeah, good catch. They don't. So, so this is something that, I mean, either your listener should work on or I at some point will start working on, is how these things like connect with each other is a problem. Because you have this sort of wild west multiplicity of heat action plans, and it's really proliferating fast. Yeah, that's the other thing I should have mentioned. We've gone from one heat action plan in 2013 to in 22, I think, my colleague Tamanna Dalal and I actually went and talked to all the state disaster management authorities in the country, and she found 36 or 37 heat action plans. And I think some of the national estimates now are 100 plus heat action plans. So basically, governments are picking up heat action plans or getting them written at the rate of knots, but with very little sort of cogency between levels. So sometimes you'll have a district and a city heat action plan that overlap with each other. Then there's, of course, the state. Nearly all the states have heat action plans at the state level, and it's unclear how they connect with various city heat action plans. So when a heat wave is declared, the heat action plan goes into effect. And then it basically prescribes to different government departments what they should be doing. Now, if you have two heat action plans and there's divergence, which one takes precedence? And if they have different command and control structures, then which one takes precedence there? And the problem is heat is not in the constitutional structure allocated between the center, state, or local level. So there's a part of the constitution that says, electricity is in the concurrent list, which means it's between the center and the states. Heat has a little bit of electricity, has a little bit of water, it has a little bit of healthcare, a little bit of urban structure and design. So some of these things are concurrent, some of these things are local, and the heat action plan kind of is supposed to knit all of this stuff together somehow. Let me put it this way. The opening stages of the policy response to heat, and India has a more sophisticated heat policy system than most countries. And there are so many of these teething problems right now of just trying to figure out how to get this working and, like the question you asked. So, yeah, very early days, I think is the way to phrase it. Yeah.
I think that's quite fascinating. And it sounds like, that immediately made me ask the question in my head, what does that mean then if two different, say, government departments or something are essentially trying to trigger two different responses on the heels of actually the same heat event? So it sounds like it could actually be a little bit of bureaucratic chaos and then thereafter have quite chaotic implications for people who are living the impacts of heat. So I think this raises like a whole bunch of questions. So the first question, I suppose, is from an institutional perspective, since that's what we were just discussing, how do we start to sort through these weeds if there are so many things at play? Like, would you suggest something like some common platform which makes sure that these different heat plans start speaking to each other? Yeah, what are your thoughts about, number one, localization of responses? And number two, how do these things kind of link together in an overarching institutional framework?
Yeah. Firstly, there's no legal basis to create homogeneity in these policy responses, or even structure, right? Even coordination. It's totally voluntary. Like if a city wants to do it or a state wants to do it, they can. The current structure actually revolves around the Disaster Management Act. So the state disaster management authorities, one of the major purveyors of heat action plans, not the only ones. There are health departments in various states that also run with this stuff. And they, along with the National Disaster Management Authority, which is their parent body, do organize like workshops and so on. So there's some level of platform creation already, but again, there's no way of coordinating all of these different actions, right? I just also want to state one more complicating factor, which is the heat response is not entirely being driven by heat action plans. So a lot of the actions, what we actually see on the ground today when it comes to, say, construction workers or people who are heavily heat exposed in other ways, farmers and so on, a lot of the actions that directly impact them are actions that come about because of emergency directives issued by higher levels of government. So the national government will tell the UP government or the Rajasthan government or whatever, look, there's a heat wave coming. We need you to push this message down about, you need to have work breaks at this time. You need to have cooling centers erected and so on. You need to push it down to local government. This happens apart from the heat action plan process. And last year, colleagues of my SFC went and interviewed a whole bunch of implementers at the local level. And it seemed to us that what gets more traction before, during a heat wave are actually those emergency directives. It's not the heat action plan itself. So we have yet another problem, which is what is actually driving a lot of action is not the plan that is developed locally, but in some places it is the plan that's developed locally. So even if you were to create a platform to get all these heat action plans nicely synced up, complementary, connecting into each other, I'm not entirely sure that will lead to more coherent implementation. We haven't really started thinking about how to target the most vulnerable, what the best solutions are, and whether any of it is working. And then there's the even more complicated thing of how do we think about Indian cities or cities globally? How should they develop? Like, what should buildings look like? What should streets look like? In what direction should architecture move? That's a higher order question that we're nowhere close to answering. So, yeah, it is with all these caveats, right? That's what India's heat response looks like.
Well, at least we're starting somewhere. It sounds like at least we have finally begun having these plans in the first place, but it also sounds like there's quite a long ways to go. It sounds like that kind of circumstance. Yeah. So perhaps we can go into a little bit more detail about what a plan looks like. So what does it entail? It sounds like now, and I was reading this in some of your past work also, where you're talking about this short-term approach where part of the problem in some of these plans is it looks like they are focused on the short term as opposed to the long term. So it would be good to understand what that means.
Normally, a heat action plan has anywhere between 20 and like 35 different solutions. And some of them are, like make sure buses don't ply at a certain time, make sure that large tourist attractions aren't functioning during a heat wave so people aren't heat exposed and so on. The way I define a short-term action is basically a bunch of these actions are about solving the heat problem and heat stress for an imminent heat wave, right? So that includes putting the water out, putting the ORS out, putting the alerts out. The effect of the solution is temporary, right? It will last a couple of days and that's it. But the problem with climate change is the number, and there are tons of studies, and including in the IPCC, that talk about how heat waves are going to get longer, more intense, and more frequent, and cover more of the planet. And this intersects with the nature of Indian urbanization. So India's cities, like many cities in the developing world and developed world, tend to pool or concentrate heat because of the cement and how close the buildings are and how traffic moves and how traffic stops and so on. And because of how sunlight hits the city and the angles at which it hits it, it tends to concentrate this stuff. And then you look at people's houses, and people's houses, a lot of them are tin roof, a lot of them are cement structures, so all the walls are cement. And so the houses themselves are heat trapping. So when you add all of this together, it becomes quite clear. Climate driving up the threat of the hazard, and then the nature of Indian urban form being particularly ill-suited to containing this problem. And then you end up with a pretty clear idea of what the policy should look like, which is have long-term solutions that actually solve the structural problems around how Indian cities work. I haven't even talked about agriculture because there's a whole separate problem, particularly from a labor migration perspective. That's also an important one because you are going to see major long-term yield declines, especially for crops, and for non-grain crops, you're going to see variation in where you can grow things. So one of the classic examples is the apples in Himachal are having to be planted higher up because of increased temperatures. And indeed, like places like Himachal are seeing heat waves. Hard to imagine. And so there you're going to start seeing, I think, the beginnings of a migration pattern that is rural to urban. I think some previous research at CPR seemed to suggest that a lot of this was not by us, but by the urban team at CPR. I think it suggested that a lot of this migration was happening to tier 2 and tier 3 towns. And so there are all these complicated dynamics that then start unfolding when it comes to heat.
And it's quite layered an issue there also because say you're moving from Himachal, the example you gave. So you're migrating from Himachal now and you're going into, say, a tier 2 city. And probably now you're moving from one area which is already heat impacted to another area which is also heat impacted in a different way. So it looks like the scale of the crisis that we're grappling with is quite sizable, unfortunately.
The people might be going from, so say a farmer might be going from a heat wave, which is a problem and impacts the crop. Basically, you don't have enough water to grow your crops, to a context where there are urban heat waves. And so if the migration is farm worker to construction worker, then you have massive exposure to heat there. But you also have the threat of flooding in a lot of Indian cities. So it's taking one set of hazards and trading it off for another set of hazards. But the big difference being the level of social capital is much less in the city, in the sense that the density of networks, the person suffering from these hazards is going to be less once you migrate. And this is known to be a big predictor of heat deaths. And this comes from like 1994, Eric Kleinenberg's work on the Chicago heat wave. He said, well, look, the density of community ties is what leads to reduced deaths.
Where the science got interesting is that I noticed something surprising. There were a number of neighborhoods that were very poor, very segregated, that looked on paper like they would do very badly in the heat wave, that turned out to be among the safest places in Chicago. What mattered was what I came to call the social infrastructure. Are there neighborhood libraries? Are there playgrounds? Are there healthy sidewalks? Are there stoops where people sit out during the day? Investing in social infrastructure is a tremendous way to revitalize poor urban neighborhoods that are in trouble on an everyday basis, and also to protect.
I'm also curious about the really vulnerable side of the migration, which is completely unintermediated, and you have a poor person in a village moving to the city and is effectively homeless for the first few weeks or months and lacks any sort of social connection. Definitely, almost definitely does not have a mobile phone that gets like nice alerts from disaster management authorities and so on, right? That group is, to me, also almost invariably, I think, end up in urban heat islands. And so that adds another sort of dimension to it, right?
No, totally. And I'm sure that there's a lot of work to be done there. I was just going to reflect on this. So your comments earlier also on how cities function and how these are also urban problems. It actually made me think of how I am sure that you are seeing in your work that there's a difference between how a kind of, say, wealth inequality and income inequality intersect with these issues, right? I'm sure that someone living in a greener area has less of a problem than someone who doesn't, especially in terms of how cool that place is in a city, right? I mean, that's my assumption. I just wanted to ask you what you thought.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, for sure. I think if you're living in a greener area, most likely it's been planned at some point. And if it's planned, the property prices are probably quite high, which means you normally have a salaried income or a substantial sort of income enough to live in that place. And that usually means you have a job that is not heat exposed, right? According to the World Bank, 75% of India's labor force is heat exposed, which is a huge, huge number. It's like more than 350 million people. And most of them don't live along shady tree-lined avenues or probably within the vicinity of any tree. So that's one aspect of it. I do think also there's a middle layer of people that live in poorly cooled spaces or houses or neighborhoods, but then work in air conditioned places or houses and neighborhoods, right? And they're constantly stuck in this middle ground where for most of the day you're in an air conditioned building, but then you're going home on your motorcycle or your scooter or the bus to a home that in a heat wave is not going to dip below 35 degrees at night or 37 degrees at night. And nighttime heat exposure is like one of the big problems in the sense that that really drives a lot of heat stress and then heat death. I read a journalistic piece that said this office worker showed up in the morning at like 9 or 10 a.m. and then collapsed. It was like an air conditioned office, collapsed and died of a heat stroke. There is a weird middle layer here that is also, I think, starting as India sort of moves up the ladder of economic sophistication. That is also then going to start becoming a problem. And I think at some point, everyone's going to just start buying ACs and already have. So then that creates a separate problem about emissions, electricity consumption, India's transition from coal, and what they call maladaptation.
So your description of drought actually reminded me of the book I am currently listening to, which is on Audible, like an audiobook, The Grapes of Wrath, because it talks so much about the Dust Bowl. Yes. And I suppose it's kind of Great Depression era Oklahoma, where a lot of people are experiencing extreme heat. And it kind of raises in your mind these images of parched lands, economic distress, people having to suddenly exit, basically, and everything that they know.
The sun flared down on the growing corn day after day until a line of brown spread along the edge of each green bayonet. The clouds appeared and went away, and in a while they did not try any more. The weeds grew darker green to protect themselves, and they did not spread anymore. The surface of the earth crusted, a thin, hard crust, and the sky became pale. So the earth became pale, pink in the red country and white in the gray country. In the water-cut gullies, the earth dusted down in dry little streams. Gophers and antlions started small avalanches, and as the sharp sun struck day after day, the leaves of the young corn became less stiff and erect. They bent in a curve at first, and then as the central ribs of strength.
I think that this thing of drought and a lack of shade also comes into question. And I know that shade is something you're interested in. So perhaps you could talk about any examples you've seen of this in your work before from anywhere in the world, in terms of shade playing an important role in the alleviation of some of this heat-related distress.
Thank you for bringing up Grapes of Wrath. I think it is, to my mind, the first climate novel. And it's just a fantastic. I think John Steinbeck is probably one of the best writers I've read. And it just captures, I think, that dynamic that we were just talking about so well, of moving from poverty to even greater deprivation and then exploitation on the other end. And then the road in the middle is super dusty and fraught, and it's lacks any shade, as you say. The shade element of it is interesting. I think I would highly recommend to your readers reading this very short piece called The Radical Politics of Shade by Mike Davis, who's this environmental historian who has now passed. And it is a very interesting, searing account of who has access to shade and who does not have access to shade. The problem is shade is a privilege. It is an elite commodity. And One of the things we did in this study recently was try and figure out a little bit about where the state plants its trees. And we had some very candid answers from some of these bureaucrats who are in charge of urban afforestation programs. And they said, look, we have, 300,000 trees that we want to plant, and we're meeting our targets. But the problem is the trees are being planted in areas where there are no people because that's where the land is. If you wanted to actually plant a tree where the heat is and where the people are, you run into pretty stiff roadblocks right at the outset because that land is hugely contested, it's hugely valuable. You can imagine the prospect of planting a tree is going to be a political thing. And so that really is one aspect of it. The second aspect of the shade conversation is also shade as a right, and retaining the sort of California example. I saw something very early on when I was starting this line of work about the California shade law, which basically mandated that farmers and agriculture workers and anybody who was exposed in a farm had access to an awning or a covering for the entirety of the day and mandatorily had to take rest in that place so that they wouldn't get heat stressed. And I particularly liked the way the law was structured. It actually said the awning or covering is considered sufficient if the shadow of the person standing within cannot be seen on the ground, which means, it is a complete covering. Like it blocks out all the sunlight. So there's a great degree of specificity there. And I'm not sure how it's implemented in California. I'm pretty sure it's violated all the time. But this is a question about whether Indian agriculture is changing. As Indian agriculture changes, can we institute better heat protections? I am not sure. And at one level, corporatization and contract farming and so on might be an avenue to do it. On the other hand, it may not. It might actually work to its detriment as traditional sort of practices of farming dissipate. But also in industries and in any place where there's any amount of heat exposure, are we at a point where we can create legislation through occupational safety standards or regulation through occupation safety standards to make sure that people have access to this, to shade at the workplace and indeed cooling, right? I think a lot of factory floors, for example, actually need air conditioning. Can we actually think about that as a requirement for employers and something that is enforced by the government? My sort of instinctive sort of answer to that is probably not, given how contentious any sort of labor standard becomes. And I think, again, US example, it has been pretty horrific to see how much capitalists push back on protections for labor, for extreme heat, to the point where Texas and Florida have actually written laws that ban local government from instituting heat protections. That's the extent. It's not even like they're not doing it. They have gone and preemptively banned actions that would mandate work breaks for workers. Every heat action plan says, you need a work break between 12 and 3, which is effectively a third of the workday. In the US, all this hullabaloo was about a 15-minute break every 3 hours or every 2 hours based on the state. Here we're talking about a 3-hour break in the middle of the day or changing the work timings entirely, which I think is a far greater cost to buildings and real estate people and capital in general. I would, and all the anecdotes suggest that none of this is happening. So none of these standards are being enforced. So yeah, very long way to go.
Yeah, it really sounds like a long way to go. And I think that we focus so much on the production side rather than actually what is the life of this person, without whom our economies are anyway not much. So perhaps we should be thinking about the human value also of their lives a lot more. But to come back to perhaps, I think that the one thing I wanted to ask is, when it comes to, say, pop culture and all of that, is there something that comes to mind where you saw heat represented or or that story really resonated with you. It could be a book, it could be a film, it could even be a song that comes to mind.
Heat Waves by Glass Animals, no, I'm different kid. The big pop culture reference is definitely sort of Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, which I think has done a huge amount in popularizing heat as an issue, and it's made it very evocative. There's an opening chapter there that is really terrible to read, but I think really has gotten the attention. I've heard government officials quote it. I've seen international media cite it. And I was at a conference of parties right after he released the book, and it was amazing to see the kind of response he got. People coming up for autographs and so on. So that was really great.
Adapt to certain temperatures that we're very close to right now. So there's two things going on. We're in an emergency situation, a decade where it's an all hands on deck type situation. And then on the other hand, we have this organization, we have this platform structured agreement, the Paris Agreement, that has the right to set up standing committees. And so I have them set up a standing committee, Ministry for the Future, and my novel's organized around that.
The other thing, the second thing I do want to sort of recommend maybe is, it's not a pop culture book. It is notionally an academic book, but by a gifted writer and sociologist, so it's sort of accessible. It's not like super data heavy or anything. Is Eric Kleinenberg's book, which is a social autopsy of the Chicago 1994 heat wave. And it's so interesting because he gets into very minute details of what it means to go through a heat wave and the cover-ups that emerged after it. And for me, that was the foundational sort of book that really got me clued into the heat world. And he also writes for The New Yorker, and I think he writes more for The New Yorker than academic work nowadays. So very high quality of prose. So I would highly recommend it. It's a bit offbeat. It's definitely not a Ministry of the Future, but yeah.
No, that sounds great. I haven't read this, so I'm definitely going to do that after our chat here. But Aditya, this has been such a wonderful and insightful conversation. Thank you so much. And please keep up the wonderful work. We will stay tuned to see what else you come up with on heat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.